Welcome back. In this module, we're going to continue looking at the colonial period, and we will focus on a little on the culture. We'll continue our discussion of the differences and similarities among the four regions of colonies. Then we'll look at a major change in European thought, which is that of the Enlightenment. And finally, we'll look at the French and Indian War in the 1750s and early 1760s, which had a profound impact in beginning to have some of the colonists not view themselves as so British as they had previously. This slide is a map which we saw in the last module, and you'll recall these are the four major regions of colonies. And in addition to those four regions, you could also group them together as North versus South, the North being, of course, the New England colonies and the Middle colonies, and the South being the Chesapeake colonies and the Lower South colonies. At this point, I'd just like to show you a little about the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Basin, since this plays a key role throughout this course. In this slide, you can see to the east, in the dark green, is the area where the 13 original colonies were, and the division point there are the Appalachian Mountains. To the left, or the east of the Appalachian Mountains, and extending all the way to the Rocky Mountains out in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. You have the light green on this map. And this is the basin of the Mississippi River system. It's technically called the watershed. And the Mississippi River, of course, is the dark blue line in the center, running from north, almost the Canadian border in the state of Minnesota, down to the port of New Orleans in Louisiana. It's important to realize that all precipitation, whether rain or snow, which falls in the watershed area, the light green area, is drained into the Mississippi River. So it's obviously a very large river, and it becomes larger and faster when the winter snows melt or if there's extensive rainfall somewhere. But in addition to the Mississippi River, please focus on a couple of major rivers here. The first is the Ohio River, which starts up in the state of Pennsylvania and forms the southern boundary of the state of Ohio as well as Indiana, and then flows into the Mississippi River. And we'll see that river was the major transportation route for much of this course when there were poor roads and before the railroad network got started. So farmers in western Pennsylvania, Ohio, that entire region would put their crops on boats, which would float down the Mississippi River. The current is going south down to the port of New Orleans. And we'll talk about that more extensively in another module where we'll look at the development of transportation. And another major river which flows from Montana in the far northwest all the way down to join the Mississippi in St. Louis, Missouri, is the Missouri River. And those are two of the major rivers that flow into the Mississippi system. Now this slide is just a detailed version of the previous slide. You certainly don't need to know all of these rivers, and these aren't all the rivers that flow into the Mississippi, so-called tributaries of the Mississippi, but you can see what an extensive river system there was. Some of these are rather shallow and only can take very, very shallow or small boats. Others are larger. And today we tend not to think too much of rivers because we think of products being transported by truck or train, but it's important to realize that over 90% of American agricultural exports flow down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans, as do many other products. In the last module, we looked at the 4 colonial regions. And for a moment here, I'd like to focus on the economic similarities and differences. In the South, we have 2 groups of colonies. We have the Lower South, the Carolinas, and there the major crops at this period were rice and indigo. Indigo is a plant which produces a purplish flower, which was very much in demand in England and other places in Europe as a dye for cloth, because at that time they did not have artificial dyes. The rice was eaten both in the United States, and a large percentage of it was exported to the Caribbean to feed the slaves working in the Caribbean in either the French, Spanish, or British colonies. And the Lower South, because of the economic system of plantation agriculture, had a great number of slaves. The other southern set of colonies are the Chesapeake Bay colonies, and you'll recall these are Virginia and Maryland. Again, many, many slaves because of the type of agriculture, and the main export from both Maryland and Virginia was tobacco, which, as we saw previously, was very, very much in demand in Europe. Now, moving north, we have the New England colonies and the Middle colonies. There were very few slaves in these colonies. There were slaves, however, and slavery, those slaves were largely working on the docks, loading and unloading ships. Some were personal servants, or some were doing other types of heavy work. But the type of agriculture in both New England and the Middle colonies did not need massive workforces such as they did in the South. New England focused on commerce. They had agriculture. It was not significant. It was not as significant as in the South because the soil was rocky because of the glaciers that came down. And they also focused on shipping. They had excellent wood, and the trees were better than the trees that were existing in Europe to produce ships. So they had many shipyards in New England. In fact, by the end of the colonial period, most of the British military ships were being constructed at shipyards in New England. But the so-called carrying trade actually made the region a rival for Britain because of the excellent ships and sailors from New England. Turning to the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, the 2 largest states, and then New Jersey and Delaware, they also engaged in trade, as did New England, particularly ports such as New York City and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But they also engaged in what's called staple crop farming. A staple crop is an agricultural crop that does not have to be eaten right away. I mean, for instance, tomatoes don't keep very long, as you know from your own personal experience, but typical staple crops would be wheat and other grains, which can be stored for a significant period of time. They also produced, like New England, much timber for use in building homes, other buildings, as well as ships. And as I mentioned previously, like New England, they had relatively few slaves. In addition to these 4 major geographic regions, there were western areas of the colonies well away from the coast, and there we had small groups of families, no real large cities, and most of the people there engaged in what's called subsistence farming, which, as the name suggests, is simply producing enough for their food, producing a little more so they could trade their surplus production for products such as coffee and sugar that were imported. This is a painting at the time of one of the large ports, And as you can see, and it's obvious, the huge number of sailing ships that were essential, not only for trade with Europe, but for trade among the colonies. We'll now turn our attention to New England. As I mentioned, many people in New England were focused on trade, and those in New England were known in Britain initially as Yankees, which at first was somewhat of an insult that, they were new, they were colonists in a rough area, but they were very, very commercially oriented. As we saw in the last lecture, New England was originally founded by Puritans, and the Puritans had a very Spartan existence. They had focused on religious piety, and in fact, they had laws that regulated prices and interest rates because it was felt that charging excessive interest was a sin, as was prices. So it was not a free market economy in any way, shape, and form. But as the strict parents died off and their children had different views, New England quickly became a very commercial area. The Puritan emphasis on education continued. And on the next slide, we'll see the first building at Yale University. This is the first building of Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, which is one of the oldest and certainly continues to be one of the most prestigious and selected universities in the United States. Now, turning to the South, the entire culture quickly became dominated by plantation owners who had most of the political power, and this obviously was impacted significantly by slavery. Here we're talking about the Chesapeake Bay colonies as well as the lower South colonies of the Carolinas and Georgia. Now, children of slaves were born free until the late 1600s, and at that point it became perpetual slavery for the entire family because it was felt that the slave children should also be part of the system. As I mentioned in the last module, the fact that there were fewer people in Britain willing to serve as indentured servants was a major factor leading to greatly increased amount of slavery, and also the fact that the Dutch control of the slave trade from Africa was reduced, and there was greater competition and brought the price of slaves down. And so what you see is by independence in the 1770s, slaves increased significantly in southern plantations, and they were over 40% of Virginia's total population, and even more in South Carolina. This is an example of an advertisement that was run in newspapers when there was a runaway slave, and there were many particularly young white people who would go out and look for black people either in small groups or alone, and the assumption was they were escaped slaves unless they had papers to document that they were on a mission for their master or that they had been given their freedom. The middle colonies, again, there was much trade, particularly in the ports in New York and Philadelphia. But New York and Philadelphia also had a very dynamic urban life, which attracted, as you would expect, particularly young men from small towns or farms. And this urban life was characterized by many cafes and publishing and a lot of political talk. And we'll see it's no coincidence as we move along that in these large cities you had people begin to discuss independence. In these cities also you had young white men serve as apprentices, And these would be for skilled trades such as being a carpenter, a cabinet maker, working in a blacksmith shop, etc. And the slaves were in New York City and other places were largely working on the docks, the very difficult work of loading and unloading vessels. This is a drawing from the time of an area in New York City, just showing again the importance of naval vessels. Now, looking forward, by the time of independence in the 1770s, in the United States, there were approximately 2 million whites and 500,000 blacks. So that's about 25% of the entire population of the United States was black. And of those blacks, only 5% were free blacks. And it's interesting, there were about the same percentage of free blacks in the northern cities as well as in the South. Here we see one of the few women professionals at the time. The woman on the right is a dressmaker, and she has obviously worked for very wealthy white women, and here she's having one of her clients try on a dress. Now let's take a step back and look at the major changes in thinking in Europe that are taking place at this time. And these changes, of course, are transferred to the British colonists, who are constantly receiving books and magazines and newspapers from Britain. The first one was the Enlightenment, and this was a revolutionary new belief in reason and progress, in human reason and progress, both in science and in society. And in the Enlightenment, many people came to believe that science, the laws of physics, etc., explain the functioning of the world. Previously, it had been attributed to God or other supernatural forces. Of great significance in the Enlightenment were two European scientists. First one, Copernicus, looking at the movement of the Earth and the planets. And the other, of course, is Isaac Newton, who developed the calculus and mathematics and used it to explain many physical phenomena. So John Locke was one of the foremost social scientists in Britain to talk about how societies, like natural science, have certain natural laws, and everything doesn't depend on a supernatural being. And we had the same thinking taking place in France at the time with Rousseau and other French thinkers. The basis for John Locke's belief of society was the so-called social contract between people and the governments that they form. And the basis of it is that people make a social contract with a government that they form, and the people agree to give up the absolute freedom to do whatever they want to, and they agree to live under a system of laws established by that government. But in return for giving up their absolute freedom, the people demand that the government protects their natural rights. And these are their natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And what is significant is that they're considered natural rights, and they're not considered rights being given by a supernatural being. A corollary of this is that governments only receive their legitimacy, authority, and political power from the consent of citizens. And John Locke and his French counterparts explicitly stated that if a government fails to serve its citizens, the citizens have the right and indeed the duty to rebel. This concept of John Locke is the entire intellectual basis for U.S. independence. This is a section from the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, which we'll explore in more detail in a subsequent module. But you can see here what I put in red, that these governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then whenever any type of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it. These leaders, who were known as deists, they believed that there was a God who created the universe. Otherwise, they can't explain how everything started. But once God created the universe, according to the deists, it just functioned according to natural laws. And the analogy they used was that of a watchmaker. A watchmaker makes a watch, winds it up, and lets it run. And for these deists, God was like a watchmaker. Looking more broadly at religion, it's important to remember that none of the colonies were welcomed dissenters. No colonies indeed allowed Catholics to vote. However, relative to Europe, the British colonies in North America did have an impressive amount of religious diversity. They essentially began to tolerate other religions, but it's important to recognize that this religious toleration was not the same as a separation of church and state, which we'll see embodied in the First Amendment of the Constitution. Rather, most of the colonies had an established religion within that colony, and people were required to pay taxes to support that church. In the 1700s, partly as a reaction to the Enlightenment philosophy, there were many Christians who sought a revival of their Christianity and their religion, and this was referred to as the Great Awakening. They wanted to awaken the Christian belief of the people. We'll see later in the course that there was a second such revival or Great Awakening about 100 years later in the 1800s. And this phenomenon took place largely in very small cities, towns, and rural areas where, of course, most of the people lived. And you had preachers wandering around, setting up huge camps and giving very, very impressive speeches. The most well-known in the 1700s was George Whitefield. It's pronounced Whitfield. He's English. He came over to give these speeches. Although his name appears to be Whitefield, it's pronounced Whitfield. People used to faint when they heard him speak, that he was such an impressive speaker. They also believed that people should study more, they should study theology, they should read more so they could defend their faith. And this greatly spurred more higher education and many, many more small church-related universities. Looking more broadly, the long-term impact of this religious revival or Great Awakening was people began to question the authority. They began to question the authority of the established churches, and it created an activism among people. Many, many people became involved in religious debates, and this will spill over shortly into political debates. And people were essentially resisting often the established churches, and so protest became much more acceptable. This is a painting of George Whitefield giving one of his sermons. His voice was so powerful that obviously in those days they didn't have microphones and amplifiers. He could speak to up to 10,000 people who could hear him clearly, and many, many people would faint after hearing him speak. Now we'll look at the relationship between the colonies and the mother country of Britain. The British kings, of course, ruled Britain. Since North America was a British colony, they also ruled North America. And they had appointed proprietors, people like William Penn in Pennsylvania and others, who were given great pieces of land as to govern on behalf of the king. And there was also a system of British governors in each of the colonies. But in London, they found it convenient to allow local governments to regulate the day-to-day affairs. It was simply too far from London to the colonies. It would take several months for a letter to go back and forth. And as we saw earlier on, since the colonies were set up by private people and not set up and financed by the British government, there were relatively few British officials in the colonies. So the local governments were allowed to continue, and they had the authority to raise taxes. As we saw earlier when we looked at Virginia, at the House of Burgesses there, they had elections among the colonists, the wealthy colonists. A man was required to have property to vote. They would have representatives, and the representatives would get together and mutually agree that it was necessary to raise taxes for public works, whether it was to build a bridge or a schoolhouse or whatever. Now, the British had regulations governing activities in all their colonies around the world, not just in North America, but there was very loose enforcement of those regulations. So over time, the colonists began to view themselves as somewhat autonomous. They were still British, but they had local colonial government. In general, the British government was generally pretty indifferent to what happened in the colonies. They had a lot going on in Europe, and Britain at this time, of course, had many other colonies. So the policy of Britain towards the colonies in North America was called salutary neglect. And this was an actual policy approved by the British Parliament, which said the government will tolerate lax enforcement of its regulations in the colonies, as long as, and this is important, as long as the colonists remain loyal in military affairs. In other words, they did not fight with Britain's enemies, and economic affairs. And the economic aspect was that certain colonial raw materials must be exported to Britain and could not be exported to other countries such as France or Spain, because the colonies belonged to Britain. And at the same time, the colonists must buy their manufactured goods from Britain. They could not buy a plow from France or some other country because it was cheaper or of better quality. It must be purchased from Britain. And those products must be transported on British ships. And now, this is not free trade as we know it today, but the system of mercantilism, which I discussed earlier. Looking again at the situation in Europe during this time period, during the first 100 years of the English colonies in North America in the 1600s, most of the violence there occurred among the colonists themselves who might fight over who was going to control land, or power struggles, or conflicts over Indians who refused to move, and so force was used against them to move them off land that the English wanted to have. We'll see in a few minutes that the Indian tribes later during the French and Indian War allied with either the British, the French, or the Spanish. Now this map shows European territorial claims in the Americas in 1754. So this is just before the outbreak of the French and Indian War, and about 20 years before U.S. independence. In the far north, we can see up in modern-day Alaska, the purplish color is our Russian settlements, and they're all along the coast because it's so cold, obviously, in the interior. And then we can see along the eastern coast of North America, the British colonies, and to the west of them in green, the French colonies, running all the way up into Canada, down all the way to parts of Texas, New Orleans, an extensive area. In fact, the green area in North America, claimed by France, is significantly greater than the yellow area along the east coast. Britain also claimed some of northern Canada, what's called Hudson Bay, that area up there, none of which is really suitable for farming. It's icy and cold, but it was useful for trapping animals. And then, of course, moving south, we have the Spanish Empire from Mexico south, and then in modern-day Brazil, the Portuguese. And then the insert to the map will show you various islands in the Caribbean. But returning to North America, you can see the British colonies on the east coast, the French colonies possession in the center. And again, remember that there were very few French in North America. And if you look closely, you can see that there is an area that has both yellow and green. And this was a disputed area because British colonists wanted to move out west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the French had a few small forts there with soldiers and tried to push them back. And it was particularly important in areas like Ohio with very, very rich soil and wonderful agricultural prospects. So we're going to come to the all-important French and Indian War, which played a significant role in changing the attitudes of many of the British colonists towards Britain. First thing to note is the name is incorrect. It's known in the United States as the French and Indian War from the 1750s until the early 1760s. From the name of it, you would think that the French were fighting the Indians. Rather, it's a war between Great Britain and some Indian tribes, Great Britain and some Indian tribes against the French and their Indian allies. So the name does not describe the participants in the war. In Europe, it was known then and still it's known as the 7-Year War. However, that's not a very accurate title because the war was not 7 years, but 9 years. For our purposes, we'll refer to it as the French and Indian War, but you'll often hear it referred to also as the 7 Years' War. Okay. The British settlements were moving westward over the Appalachian Mountains in the area claimed by France. Now, France did not have many farmers there. In fact, the French were focused on trading with the Indians to trap fur. But in an effort to stop the British encroachment on their territory, they had put some small military forts. And so George Washington, whom of course we all know, at that point, obviously a British colonist, very British, was in the Virginia um, militia, and he was asked by the British government in London to lead a British expedition to cross the mountains to tell the French to back off, not to bother the British, and the British had the right to move, felt they had the right to move. Well, that led to warfare, at first with a major defeat for the British forces, led by George Washington and others. And this war, which was sparked in North America, quickly spread across Europe, with the French and British fighting in Europe. It went to India, other places in Asia, and the Caribbean islands. So some people actually say it was the first World War or global war, not World War I, which started in 1914. For the British, this was a huge military effort. In fact, it was the largest war expense in British history until that time, because it was a global war. In North America, about 25,000 British troops crossed the Atlantic to fight in this long, protracted war. And then there were 24,000 British colonists who fought side by side with the British against the French and their Indian allies. So we had 24,000 colonial troops, so roughly 50,000 men under arms. And they had some Indian allies assisting the British. The French were able to attract more Indian allies because the French would trade with the Indians. The French were not trying to take the Indian land to establish agricultural settlements, and the French would treat the Indians as trading partners, and so obviously the Indians preferred that. That said, the British did have some Indian allies, and in fact, during this relatively long war, sometimes various groups of Indians changed sides more than once. Here we can see the major groupings of Indians. Of course, there are many, many more Indian societies or tribes than shown here, but you can see in the north the various tribes in the Huron Confederacy, and you can see below that in blue the Iroquois, and in the south, southeast, you can see the Creek Indian groups. So as I mentioned, George Washington led the first expedition to talk to the French. The French responded with gunfire and he quickly retreated. He later returned as second in command with British General Braddock, who was sent with many, many French troops and colonial troops to drive the French out of the Ohio River Valley. And what we see in this painting is we see George Washington on the white horse on the right, and immediately to our left, we see General Braddock, who had been shot, and General Braddock died shortly thereafter. So George Washington, in fact, took command of the British soldiers and fought throughout the French and Indian War to eventually defeat the French. In this painting, this is actually a painting of a British victory in Quebec in Canada. But what we see in this painting, I think, is of great significance. On the left, in the foreground, we have an Indian depicted because this was an Indian ally. And again, both sides had Indians. Well, the net result of the war was a major defeat for France. And here we can see on this slide what the situation was when the war started. We had Great Britain on the east coast of the United States with its colonies, France in the large blue area, all the way from Canada down across the Mississippi River and out west. And at the end of the war, which was settled by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Great Britain acquired from France all of the territory to the west of the Mississippi River. You see that huge increase in the size of Great Britain's colonies in North America, and also acquired the area in Canada to the north. To the east of the Mississippi River, there was a deal struck where Britain gave that land to Spain, and in return, Spain gave Great Britain what is now Florida. So the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which ended the war, in addition, gave France most of its possessions around the world. France gave Britain most of its possessions around the world. But the end of the war, while a victory for the British, they acquired significantly more territory in North America and many French possessions around the world. The huge military outlay resulted that the English government was deeply in debt. And we'll see in the next module how significant that debt was. At the end of the war, the colonists, who were British, they had fought side by side with the British soldiers. Many had died, been wounded, maybe lost an arm or leg or paralyzed. They celebrated the victory as their victory. They were British. However, this 7-year battle with colonists fighting with the British against the French in North America also began to create significant splits between the colonists and the British on both sides. Many of the colonists who had served as soldiers felt that the British were arrogant and looked down upon them because the British had better uniforms, they were professional military, whereas the colonial soldiers were farmers who didn't know how to march as well, and they felt that they were treated like second-class citizens. The British soldiers who came over, roughly 25,000, didn't have British bases to stay in. So the British government required the colonists to put British soldiers in their homes and did not reimburse them for the expense. So they might say to a family, well, you have 3 or 4 bedrooms. The children can move into the master bedroom with the parents, and we'll put 6 soldiers in the other bedrooms. And this went on for several years. The colonists got nothing. In addition, the colonists were required to provide food to the British soldiers, and these are obviously hungry young men who eat a lot. And of great significance, something we wouldn't think of today, is the colonists were required to provide free of charge candles to the British soldiers and other officials staying in their homes. Now, candles were very expensive at that time. They were all handmade. The farmers would make them themselves, usually not of beeswax, but of animal fat. And it was a tedious process. You'd have to dip the wick in, coat it. And the candles actually were more expensive than the food for the colonists. On the British side, many of the British who in London and the British officials in North America were very upset that during this war, some colonists were trading with France. France was the enemy. But some colonists, particularly those in the north, were saw this as an opportunity to make money and trade with the enemy. And so there was a feeling in London that these colonists in Britain somehow, these colonists in North America are somehow not really loyal British. The net result in the colonists is you have many, many colonists by the mid 1760s when the war ended. This is 12 years from independence. You have colonists now really, they have dual loyalty. They have loyalty to Britain, the British Empire. They've always been proud to be British. They read British newspapers, British books. Obviously, they speak the British language. They drink tea, and they follow the latest fashions from Britain. But they also have an increased loyalty to the local community. Many of the colonists, the majority, had been born in the colonies, and perhaps their grandfathers or parents had moved over from Britain, but they had a strong attachment to the local community and their local institutions of self-government, which they used to govern themselves locally. In the next module, we'll see how this conflict of loyalties greatly increases over the next 10 or 12 years and eventually leads to the Declaration of Independence. Thank you.